So we're very lucky to have Joyce Roché with us here today. If you've looked at her bio, I hope you have, because it's remarkable, a remarkable set of accomplishments in the private sector and in the non-for-profit world. As a board of director, as a board member, an author and award winner. She's a Columbia alum, which I love, and I think as the students hear her during the course of this session, they're going to find her to be charming and insightful and just a wonderful person to converse with. So, Joyce, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Al, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Just so everybody knows, the way I think we're going to approach this is we've actually got 5 topics that we want to cover that Joyce will comment on, and I'll tee each of those topics up sequentially as we go through the session with a question. The topics are going to be, the first one's going to be about the racial strife and inequality that we're seeing happening right now, and we'll talk about that. The second topic will be about managing the career impact of the pandemic. Then we'll talk about diversity and inclusion. We'll talk about the not-for-profit world, and then if we have the time at the end, we may talk about corporate governance. So why don't we start with, boy, there's just so much strife in the United States these days. It's just horrible, and it's putting such a sharp point on the level of inequality in the country, and it's just terrible. And I know, Joyce, you said, we were just talking a moment ago about what kind of leadership role can people play in actually making this better and making an impact. I know you said you're talking to some of your friends and colleagues about this. So what are your thoughts?
Well, Al, as we began this morning, we didn't think we'd be starting this way, but a lot has happened in the week and a half since we chatted, and in this last week, I think all of our hearts break for the one more time of seeing an instance that we did in Minnesota, and then the protest, which you applaud the fact that people are standing up and saying this is not right. The looting, nobody accepts that, but you will always have the good and the bad. But I think what we've got to do, and as we were saying, I'm sure all of us have seen letters, videos from so many different walks of life, from the corporate side, from the sports side, education side. Everybody is condemning basically not just the issue, but the systemic issues that were the result, that ended up being the result of it, the inequality that we're talking about, both from an economic, educational, all of the different issues of inequality, health. And I think we're all asking this question, what part can I play in this? And as I mentioned, another friend and a couple of friends are having a conversation next week to look at, what role can we potentially play to try and make a difference. And as I said, there's been so many wonderful comments being written, especially on the corporate side. And, the action from Bank of America with its $1 billion fund that they just put forth, or Randall Stevenson, who I know very well, the chairman of AT&T. I worked with Randall for over 20 years on the board. And Randall believes this, and he's challenging the CEOs to really step up to the plate, to do something. So the leadership that they can play, and that's what he talked about, the leadership that business can play in this whole myriad of issues is critical. And yet I'm hoping that it won't just be a situation where we're giving lip service to it, or all of these good ideas or intentions won't materialize because somehow there's not leadership to kind of harness it all. And that's my biggest wish. I wish I could, give an answer to it, but I do know that in order for this to be something, in order for really there to be action, there has to be leadership. And maybe it is leadership in different sectors, but there has to be leadership that takes this on and really starts to move the needle on it, and not again say, okay, well, we talked about it, and then the next instance comes up and we're right back where we were.
Well said. I realize I didn't mention that if people want to ask questions, they can raise their hand,
Yeah.
and I didn't mention that at the beginning. So if you have questions or comments, you can go for it right now and on this particular topic. And so if anybody in the audience has something they want to ask, go ahead. And
Absolutely. Or ideas.
Yeah, I mean, even ideas. I mean,
Yeah.
I sure hope this is different this time. Maybe I'm optimistic that it's so acute, and maybe the fact that it's happened at the same time as the pandemic just put such a sharp point on it that hopefully it won't just be talk, and and there actually will be some progress. I mean, anyway, it's just a horrible situation.
Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? No? Okay.
Oh, okay.
Well, Katie, the way they do this is they raise their, do they know how to raise their hand for a question?
Hi, this is Sandra.
Oh,
yes.
Sandra.
Yeah, everyone, please feel free either to use the chat function, which I know you all know how to use because we've been in classes remotely for a while. And also, if you want to either raise your hand and unmute yourself and share your video, please, this is a wonderful opportunity to interact in person with our terrific speakers. Thank you.
Actually, we decided not to do this as a webinar so that people can be visible on the screen when they and have that interaction. So again,
Yeah.
any questions on these comments or comments that you have, or thoughts or ideas? Okay. So the second thing that we wanted to talk about which is top of mind for many students, is about the career impact of the pandemic. And, it's the quarantine and the economic challenges have turned a lot of our students' lives upside down in terms of their full-time employment or summer internship. And they're very concerned about this. Joyce, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, you told this terrific story about, actually, I don't know if it was a relevant story. It probably wasn't a terrific story. It was a very relevant and apropos story about when you were graduating from Columbia, which was in 1972. The students here probably don't know that 1972 was not a good time for the economy in the United States. And as I recall the story, you graduated in January, and you said there was only one company interviewing on campus, and that was the Scott Paper Company. And they didn't hire women, is what you said. So, I mean, I suspect that most of the students don't realize what it was like for a woman, an African-American woman, to be graduating from an MBA program in 1972. It was pretty unusual. And I can't even imagine, I can't imagine how many women or African-Americans were even in your class. I can't imagine there was more than a handful at the time, but.
That's exactly right. And it was interesting about Scott Paper Company, considering I was in marketing. That was my concentration. And here was a product that, it was primarily bought by women. And they had nobody in their marketing department at that point, or that's what I was told. But anyway, back to the story. Yes, it was an interesting time. I went through the summer. That was when, I don't know if we still do it, where you could do a full semester during summer and therefore graduate in January. So I did. And I guess the biggest learning, I will say, to start out, is that I think you've got to keep your focus on where you see and where you want your career to go, even if it gets deferred for a little bit. That's kind of the headline, if I can put it there. But I was a poor kid from New Orleans, and I needed to find a job. And so even though I was trying to find a job in marketing, which was the field that I had chosen, and continued even after I left Columbia to send out resumes. And I stayed very closely connected to the career office, the placement office, I forgot now what it was called, and to ensure that if anything came up, I would be aware of it and could jump right on it. Well, during that time, there was an opportunity that came into Columbia's office that I became aware of, and that was with the City University of New York. And they were recruiting MBAs, not just from Columbia, from Harvard, et cetera, to help take the university in a different direction, was basically what they said. So I applied for the job. It was in the business office of the university and got it. But after I understood, and I actually worked on a project for about 6 months, which was trying to look at the 20 city colleges, which were a part of the university, to try and look at them as profit centers or cost centers, and see who was being productive and who wasn't being productive, and would that lead to any recommendations. But after I understood the job that I had and understood basically, what it was I was to do, I started sending out resumes again, because I knew this was not where I wanted to be, but I did need to eat. So I continued to send out resumes, to continue to stay focused on what I thought I wanted to do with my career. And so after 9 months, I was able to secure a position with Avon, and really on the ground floor. It was an entry-level position in marketing at Avon, and that allowed me to make the transitions to a marketing job. So that's why the headline, I think, is important, is that even though things may not be ripe for what it is you decided you wanted to do when you left Columbia, or what I wanted to do when I left Columbia, I had to keep focused on the fact that this is what I thought I wanted to do, and I needed to give myself the chance to do it, even though it may take me a little bit longer to start that career.
Yeah, I think you may have had more self-confidence than I did when I was coming out of school, because I know when I was looking for a summer job, I sent out 100 letters to. I basically went through the Fortune 100 and wrote a letter to the CEO of every Fortune 100 company, offering up to asking about his summer employment. And one morning the mail came, and there were 27 letters, back from these people. And every one of them was a letter of rejection. And and it was in the face of that, I have to tell you, my confidence was a little bit rattled, or more than rattled. So I don't know. I mean, that's sort of what the topic of your book is about, conquering self-doubt. And I mean, how did you said you kept focused on what you wanted to do, but how did you actually do that and not let the pressure or the rejection get to you?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. One, as I said, I was poor, and I was actually living in Johnson Hall. So I had to get out of the dorm, actually. So I needed to find somewhere to live, was the first thing, because I knew that, by the way, my undergraduate degree was in math education. So I always knew I had the fallback, that I could go back to New Orleans and teach school. But that isn't why I went to Columbia.
Of course.
And so, so I had a very good friend who allowed me to live with her rent-free, while I continued to try and stay focused on trying to get a position somewhere. And luckily it was not a year, because I think it really would have been a big challenge if it had been a longer period of time. It was probably about, I would say, maybe 3 months after I left, maybe a little bit less, about 3 months. And before I got the position at City University, and of course then could take my share of expenses on then. But I believe it was just that I had, in the back of my head, I knew I made the decision to leave New Orleans, to come to Columbia for a reason, that I thought there was an opportunity to do something I had never even thought about, didn't even know marketing existed until I got at business school. And so to just give that up without giving it a full shot just didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I don't know whether it was confidence or the fact that I didn't want to go back home and look like a failure, basically, because that's how I felt. I just stayed focused on it, and it, you know, it was lucky that I got the job that allowed me to be able to eat and live, and then at the same time, it was a little deferred, but I was able to do what I had intended to do.
Great. We have any questions from the audience? No?
No?
Come on, guys. You know, one of the problems with doing this on Zoom, you see, if we were live, at work, you know, when I was working, and we'd be doing, say, a town hall meeting, you know, I'd go out to factories, you do a town hall meeting. If nobody asked a question, I would say to them, okay, if nobody asks a question, I'm just going to look at somebody and I'm going to just stare at them until they ask a question, and that would make people nervous. Then they'd start at it. But I can't do that on the Zoom call, so I've got to. So is anybody have anything, or there we go.
I see coming on.
Yes.
So I found it really surprising when you said that the only person who was hiring just straight up said they would take women. I assume that that's not the first time, and probably wasn't the last time that you encountered someone just saying no. I guess I wonder kind of how you navigate that, because obviously you could just get mad at this, at the way it is, or trying to figure out how you're gonna, you know, make your way in anyways.
Well, I think the getting mad is not going to be helpful. Yes, I was mad, but I knew that wasn't going to get me a job either. So I could not, I think for a lot of, in my head, it was, I can't let anybody else dictate what it is I think I want and can do. So keeping that front of, you know, in the front of my mind, I think was the motivation, that I couldn't let it dictate. You know, I had to give it my all to try and see. And you know, one of the things, I don't know if we talked about it before, is that I will always say is that, you know, people early in my career, in terms of evaluations, women often got the X saying they weren't risk takers. You know, it was that you don't take enough risk. Well, I think the biggest risk that you can take is actually on yourself. And you've got to take that risk and not let someone, whoever the days are, say, no, maybe there's a different way of doing it. And that's, I guess, what kept me going.
So, you know, when I work with students through the executives and residence program, one of the things that I try and encourage them to do is to be persistent and be in charge of their agenda, okay, their lives, and be persistent, and almost and this isn't always that easy to do. So it's easy to say, but it's not always that easy to do. But
No.
you know, but don't take no for an answer, and be in charge of yourself. And also, if there are issues around your getting a job or something, treat it as a business, almost like try and treat it clinically. It's an issue to be resolved. It's not a personal thing. It's just a problem to be solved. And I mean, I just heard you kind of say similar things there. You didn't use those words, but that's kind of what you just said. And it's actually quite surprising to me that somebody who was that young, I mean, I think it showed a lot of maturity for somebody who was just graduating from an MBA program to be able to do that, because it's not that easy to do, and it's something that over time, with maturity and confidence, people learn how to do. But I really was. Anyway, it's amazing that at that age you were able to kind of process it the way you did. So, is there a question in the chat room there? I see a chat on the chat board. Can you see that? It says, did you have hesitations to take an entry-level position post-MBA, or were you confident you could progress quickly once you got it?
Well, you know, when now I'm going to really shock you, whoever sent that question. Not only was it an entry-level position after having my MBA, it was like $13,000. You know, So you can all laugh now at that. But no, I didn't, because I had, as I said, I didn't even know about marketing before I went to Columbia. And because I had been a math major, and I had never I'd used the analytical side of my brain, but I'd never used the creative side of my brain. And so to me, it was a wonderful combination of the two. So to be able to get in a position that, in fact, I felt like I could do something with this thing and learn something that really I found very exciting. I love the field of marketing. So getting into an entry-level position didn't bother me at all, because I figured that I could work hard enough to be able to move up pretty quickly.
Are there other questions? Anyone? There we go.
Hi, yes, this is Alex. Thank you for speaking. I had a little bit of a question related to persistence and sort of what you had been speaking about earlier. How do you manage the feeling of perhaps especially in a large organization not moving quickly enough? And I don't know if that's a symptom of today's, being a founder under 30 or having your own company extremely young. But I'm personally in a rather bureaucratic institution in finance, and it's very, you can feel like you're being persistent and you're being, as a woman, more, I don't know what the word is, but like affirmative and not aggressive, but it's hard to see yourself getting somewhere when it's a huge bank or something.
Yeah, yeah. No, I understand exactly what you're talking about. And I think, when I talked about taking a risk on yourself, sometimes you have to. And sometimes that risk is taking a sidestep to take action. And I did do that. When I went to Avon, I moved up pretty quickly in the first 5 years. And so that was fine. But then it was like, okay, it was like a door kind of closed and the stall happened, which is, I think, what you're talking about. And I was beginning to feel like, okay, what happened? What's the change? And I really did feel that it was, there were a lot of people saying, let's see what she could do. But then as I got further up, it was more questions of, can she do it? As opposed to, let's see what she could do. Mm-hmm. And I could hear, and I mean, nobody verbalized it, but I kind of had the feeling that that's what was going on. So I started to, I don't know whether it was a coincidence or what, but an opportunity came to me to make a move to Revlon. And the cultures were like night and day, let me tell you, completely different. But at the same time, Revlon was a company at that point that was at the epitome of the cosmetics industry. Mm-hmm. And so I said, okay, I can stay here and try and fight, and see if I can move the level a little bit more, or I can go over here, which was the next level position up. I was a manager, I was going into a director's role, mm-hmm. and make that side move to do that, even though I knew it was a tough culture, because I said to myself, what's the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that can happen is that I'm there maybe for about a year. They fire me, but I'd have Revlon on my resume. And that wasn't bad at that time. So I ended up having to make a move off of center because it was, the opportunity just wasn't there anymore. Mm-hmm. And it turned out after I was at Revlon for 2 years, Avon came and recruited me back. But sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes, because the worst thing, and I would always tell people who were in my organization or who I was mentoring or whatever, the worst thing that can happen is to stay somewhere and get dissatisfied, and then you start to impact your attitude, your performance, because that's not helpful. And the only one that is impacted negatively by that is you. So it's better to start to think, maybe I like it here, but maybe this is not the best place at this time. So
Mhm.
sometimes you got to make that change. Sometimes you do.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So why don't we kind of slide into the second topic, because it actually is kind of continuum with what you're talking about right here, and it kind of melds together. And so this is around diversity and inclusion, but specifically, I mean, as I described at the beginning, as you just talked about, you've had great success in executive roles. You've done the Girls Incorporated situation or organization, led that for many years. So how did you do this? How did you navigate, kind of the barriers? You talked a little bit about this, but how did you navigate the barriers for women, for African-American women? I mean, it was not easy it's still not easy, but it was really not easy back then. And how did you do it?
Well, it is interesting. We've evolved into so many iterations of diversity and inclusion. It used to be, I remember at Avon, we started, it was called multiculturalism, and then it became diversity, and now it's diversity and inclusion. And frankly, I don't believe you can have diversity without inclusion, because then it's just lip service, or it's counting the numbers, or counting the bodies, or checking the box. For me, basically, and I will say this was not necessarily healthy, let me preface it with that, but I worked like crazy. I over-prepared for everything. I didn't want to give the slightest instance of not anticipating a question that might come to me. And we talked about my book, and that's basically a lot of the book is the whole idea that whoever the they were in power, might be feeling like at certain times I wasn't up to snuff, that I wasn't smart enough, that he didn't have enough experience. So with that kind of in the back of my head, it caused me to, even though the evidence of promotion or moving up the ladder may be happening, I felt like I had to always work harder. I always had to over prepare. I always had to do more. And because I was afraid that just outside the door was failure, frankly. And so I learned after a long time, I will say a very long time, that I was good enough. But it did take a lot of what the drive was just the fear of failure. The drive was that because I was different, I was a woman of color, and that, I felt like there were assumptions being made without me even being able to show who and what I was. So therefore, I had to let my work show that, get the evidence, in a sense, let the reputation start to build, and then use that reputation to try and push through. So it was all, lots of times they were kind of having to ignore some stuff, and find the opportunity to move myself when it was time to move myself. I had to do that at one point, where I had someone I reported to who saw me in a very small and narrow box, and it was his message, not verbalized, was that, I think that can only do so much. Well, after a while of trying to counter that, there was someone who earlier on in my career that I worked for, that I just picked up the phone and said, you got to help me get out of here, because this guy is not going to see me in a different light. So sometimes you got to use your chips. Sometimes you got to suck it up. And sometimes you're working like crazy. But I think at the same time, you got to remember, and that's the thing that in the book that I talk about, is that you worked hard, you have the experience, you deserve to be here. And it took me a long time to understand that.
Wow. It must have been pretty stressful with some of that early on. I mean, I know there were times in my career where I kind of felt the same way, but again, I wasn't in the same situation by any means that you were. So, questions from the audience? Anybody? Any thoughts? So, you know, you, in the book, I think you talk about this imposter syndrome, and you actually didn't, I don't think you just touched on that, did you? You maybe alluded, you didn't use those words, but you maybe you touched on that concept. Like and talk about that, and, you know, again, how you navigated it and worked around it and did
Sure.
what you needed to do.
Yeah, the book is on the imposter syndrome, and it's basically my story. I tell people, and it is interesting. I did it as after I left Girls Inc. As a result of a book that I had contributed to called "What I Know Now: Letters to My Younger Self," that was written by Ellen Spraggan, and she asked 30 women this question: if you could speak to your 30-year-old self with the knowledge that you have today, what would you say? And it just took me right back to the time in corporate where as I talked about, I was working like crazy, over preparing for everything and just not being comfortable, even though the evidence that should have been there, that I was able to do this thing, there was never any comfort or calmness in there. And so as I described this letter in Ellen's book, a number of people sent me emails and letters, and just a lot of people I didn't know saying, oh my God, you're telling my story, you need to do a book. And I did do it when I left Girls Inc. and it's called The Empress Has No Clothes, Conquering Self-Doubt to Embrace Success. But it was about this whole idea of being different. I realized, I didn't know that when I did the letter that this was called the imposter syndrome, but someone told me that. And they told me that it had actually been researched by 2 psychotherapists in the late 70s. So I looked it up, and actually reached out to one of the 2 psychotherapists when I decided to do the book, Dr. Oh goodness, I'm drawing a blank on her name. Anyway, I reached out to her to let her know that I was doing this book. And so I said I was going to be about my story, but I knew that there were a lot of people who had similar stories, people who had done well. And I wanted to include them in the book because I wanted this to be something that people who dealt with this understood. It wasn't just me, that a lot of people deal with this. And the other message, it was Dr. Pauline Clance. Another message that she articulated to me is that it doesn't mean you won't be successful. In fact, more successful people have the imposter syndrome than those who don't. And it's because you're constantly driving to prove you deserve to be where you are. But I did understand at that point that there are triggers to this thing. And the triggers happen whenever you are different. So the difference could be, and Alex mentioned the financial institutions, you still see a heavier weight of male versus female populations in that industry. And so a trigger for the imposter syndrome is a woman in a predominantly male environment, because what she's thinking, she's getting the message basically that she's thinking that they are thinking that she's not as smart as they are. She's probably not a good leader. She doesn't have level experience, et cetera, et cetera. So what does she do? She works like crazy to counter what she thinks they're thinking about her. Well, the same thing is a person of color in a majority environment. The same idea is that what we think is that they are thinking we probably don't have a very good education. We probably don't have great experience. We probably don't really fit. And so you work like crazy to counter this. But this idea of being different has a lot of dimensions to it. I interviewed for the book 2 white CEOs, 3 white CEOs, who said to me, I've dealt with this. In fact, Ed Whitaker, who was the former CEO of AT&T, was one of the first people who said to me, isn't this something that women deal with, Joyce? I've dealt with this my entire career. And I'm saying, what could be his trigger? What could be his trigger? Well, his trigger was that his family, he grew up in a family with limited economic means. So the expectation when he was growing up was that he wasn't going to even go to college. And so now he found himself, he became an engineer. He found himself moving up very quickly And he was competing, or his peers became people whose families had a lot of resources. So his big question, his big difference was that. And he kept in the back of his head this idea, am I accepted or acceptable in this group that I'm now finding myself? So this idea of being different, it could be somebody gay in a straight environment. It's that idea where these triggers will cause you to question whether or not others see you as being good enough, smart enough, experienced enough to be where you are.
Yeah, when you were talking a few minutes ago about when you first started talking about this, I was thinking about many of the people I know who are really successful, and it's remarkable how many people actually are driven to some extent by this. I mean, if it's insecurity is the right thing. I mean, even white males who they feel like they don't belong, so they work hard, just what you said, they work harder and they're more driven just to prove that they belong. It's quite, and of course it's magnified for women and people of color. It's orders of magnitude more, more prevalent there.
And Dr. Clance actually said that there is, because as I've been speaking on the book for the last few years, one of the questions was, is it the same as insecurity? And it's different, she said.
It is.
Because insecurity, you get to a point where you think this is a ceiling and I really can't go above that ceiling. People with the imposter syndrome are constantly working to prove that they can go beyond.
I see. Yeah. And
so when constantly pushing, another opportunity comes up, and then they find themselves somewhere else that they think, oh my gosh, are they going to find out this time that I'm not as smart or not as good or not as experienced as that? And so they work like crazy again, and they get another opportunity. So that push and creates the accomplishments that constantly go there. And that's why you tend to have it more.
When that student a couple minutes ago was talking about working, I guess she suggested she worked at a bank. I don't know if she actually said that, but the thing that was in my mind was one of the things about choosing where you work is to make sure that, you fit in with the culture of the institution. And, the term I use is sort of having a common DNA, if, maybe that's overstating it, but that's the way I think about it. And, it's really impossible to be successful over the long haul working in a company where you're not comfortable with the culture of it. And, in her case, in that student's case, I don't know if it's hard to say whether she's in the right culture or not, but, sometimes it's just frustration about something, but other times it's not the right place for you. And in fact, the stress of spending all day in an organization where you're not wired the way everybody else is wired, you don't have the same values, and those don't have to be, but values. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
The questions? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And that's what I was saying about taking that risk on yourself. Sometimes the culture isn't, because as Dr. Clance said to me, sometimes these ideas, these feelings that are driven, in terms of the imposter syndrome, or emotional reactions to what is happening, or to what you're feeling, but sometimes it's really happening.
Yeah.
So when it's really happening, you understand, and that's where you've got to kind of separate it out. You got to look at, well, when does this happen? Is it only with one group, or is it only with one person, or is it only with one kind of situation, or is it systemic? In which case it's probably cultural. And if it's systemic, then you've got to ask yourself, is this the culture for me? Is this the culture I see myself in? Is this the place that I think I will thrive in? And if not, that's when you've got to make some big decisions.
Yeah. And well, actually, I'm going to ask you another question, but before I do that, are there questions from the audience? Anybody or comments? I don't know. Come on, guys. All right. Well, you were talking about taking a risk. I guess you were talking about when you moved to Revlon, right? You went from Avon. I think that's what you were referring to. And you said something that was so good. You said, what was the worst thing that was going to happen to me, right? And I think your answer was, well, maybe I'll get fired, right? And so, sometimes you'll hear people, I used to hear for somebody who was working for me at PepsiCo, where you'll just hear people say, well, that's too risky. And but wait a second, guys, let's just take a step back. What exactly is the risk here? I mean, it's one thing if I'm going to bet my whole, net worth on, on the roulette wheel. And if I lose it, I'm going to be destroyed for the rest of my life. Okay. That's risk. Okay. Risk isn't, I'm going to try and push the envelope a little bit in my job and try and drive something. And if I fail, I fail. I can always pick up the pieces. So I actually think that was I thought that was a very insightful comment when you made that, and when you talk to when I and others talk to students again as part of the executive residence program about careers, there are these concepts of nonlinear career paths. I don't know if you've heard that lingo, but that's the lingo the business school uses, which is a career path isn't straight, it meanders, and there's that concept, and then there's also this concept of roll the dice a couple times. What's the worst thing that's going to happen to you? And because again, you're not playing with your life. You're not your physical well-being. You're not playing with your children or anything. Just roll the dice a couple times, and it fits into the context of this nonlinear career path. So, and I think the things you've been describing are prime examples of that kind of thought process. Anyone in the audience? No. Yes, please.
This is Sandra. I have a quick question. I mean, we're often, when people are evaluating new career opportunities, doing due diligence on the culture, I think the standard advice is, go and speak to as many people who do work there or have worked there in the past. Joyce, are there instances where when you look back, it was like, oh, I missed something about the culture, that now I know to look for in my next organizations that you ended up working at? Are there, like flags or things that sometimes people miss?
I don't know I think you can. And in fact, the instance that I talked about with Revlon, there was a friend who had actually gone over there and she told me, don't come. And she described the culture completely. But again, I went for a different reason. So I went with eyes wide open. Another risk I took was after I'd become an officer at Avon, and I left the company without a job because I didn't see it just didn't seem like, at that point, I'd held every marketing job in the company. And I didn't see the road going anywhere after that. So I left. And decided that I was going to step out and just see, in a sense, believe my press, see how good I was, what opportunities might be there. And it was an opportunity to do something different. And I ended up going with a smaller company here in Savannah, but there was the opportunity to become president of that company. And I didn't see that in the viewpoint of Avon. And so I did, and I did not in that instance, Sandra. I don't know that I could have taken very much because it was a company that was privately owned. An investor group was buying it, and I went in as a part of this new investor group as a new management. And so it wasn't so much that the culture existed, it was what the investors brought as the culture in there. So I don't know that I would have been able to understand it. I probably could have understood the guys who were doing the deal and maybe their kind of way of functioning. I probably could have done more due diligence on that. But it was different. What I was sold in terms of their reason, which was a long-term view to the business, was not what they saw. They were looking at a way of getting it to a point of being able to take the company public or selling it. And that's not what I had signed up for. And so I guess I could have done more there. But again, when it got to a point that the culture was one and they had brought in a new guy, because I was president, but there was a former CEO who I knew we had very distinctively different roles, but a new guy they brought in, and it just didn't work. At that point, I was at a point that I said, I don't need this. And so I will now activate my contract and I will decide to do something different. So sometimes you can ask around and try and get a sense, but you really often don't know. Although my friend gave me a pretty good idea of what Revlon was like, and it was, but sometimes you don't get that clearer picture, and you've got to just assess it yourself and understand that maybe this isn't quite what I thought it was. And then you've got to do what you need to do.
Is there a question from Lila? Is it Lila?
Yeah, it's Lilla.
Lila, sorry.
Yes. First of all, thank you. I think it's very inspirational, and it's kind of enlightening to me that I think I also have the imposter syndrome. And I just wanted to ask you, like you mentioned that when you wanted to switch, you talked to your mentor, and you also mentioned that somehow eventually this syndrome disappeared. And I just wanted to ask you, what were some practical steps or routines that you made to make this syndrome go away?
Oh, well, first, Lila, let me say, it doesn't go away. One of the things, and that's why the book says conquering it, because I will tell you throughout my career in different, even when I became a board member, and I thought this thing was out of me, it came creeping back, because now I found myself in a different kind of environment with different kinds of people. I was one of few women on the board. There were two of us, and most of them were CEOs. I was president of a company, but I wasn't a CEO. And so I started questioning whether or not I fit. But I think, as I talk about in the book, there are a couple of things that you can do. And the number one thing you can do is not to be silent about it. And when I say that, I don't mean talking to your boss or whatever. I'm talking about talking to people who you trust, who know you, know your abilities, and can basically let you see the things that you ignore. They can let you, if the imposter syndrome starts to come up, and it often does happen when you have a new opportunity or you have something different or, to do or promotion or whatever, it starts to creep in to say, okay, now they're going to find out. They're going to find out that you're not really up to snuff on this. Well, this trusted friend, colleague, partner, whoever it is, who knows you, can let you see, you've done this, you have these credentials, you have this kind of experience, you have this, you've done this. Why are you so concerned about this thing? And often it's usually one little thing that we have that we think is going to be the thing that's going to trip us up. And I'll tell you my little thing that I thought was going to always trip me up. And that's from Columbia, when I had to take accounting. I hated accounting. And yet I was a numbers person, so it didn't make any sense to me until I realized that math was a logical science and accounting wasn't. That it was based on rules. And I kept trying to fight the rules. That once I understood the rules, I could deal with it. But when I went onto that corporate board, for example, I knew that it wasn't just about P&Ls, that I needed to understand capital allocation. I needed to understand, talk about and understand the company from all its financial aspects. I couldn't just be sitting in the chair and only talk when they were talking about consumer issues or women's issues. I needed to be a full participant. So there's always a little something in the back of your head that you think is a flaw. And it's better to just put it out in the open, in the air, and put it in view and say to yourself, what can I do about it? And my to do about it when I went on that corporate board was to take out my old accounting books and start reading again. So there's always something there. But like I said, talk to someone who knows you and can help you understand that. Don't let the thing that is the new or the thing that you think is maybe a slight flaw be the thing that overshadows all the value that you bring. So, those are just some of the things that you can do, and often listen to the things that people have acknowledged in you that you've done great at. Because what we often do is we're so concerned about not being boastful or not being ingenuous that we ignore them, and we start to say, oh, it wasn't a big deal. Oh, you know, anybody could have done it. No, you did this. So take it and use that as a part of your arsenal. So there are a lot of different techniques that start to create what I call internal validation, because that's what imposter syndrome is, always looking for external validation. You need to learn how to internally validate yourself.
You know, I think one of the things that I was often reluctant to do in my career was to ask people's advice when I was unsure about something. I mean, kind of what you're, and, you know, in hindsight, one of the greatest forms of flattery is when someone asks you for advice.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And so, you know, to the students, I would say, if you're not sure, if you're feeling insecure, whatever, you're not know where to go, if you ask people for guidance and you show just a little bit of vulnerability and a willingness to learn, okay, a willingness to learn and a willingness to grow, 9 times out of 10, the person's going to be happy that you asked them, and be flattered in a way and you'll get a constructive answer. Well, maybe 1 time out of 10, someone will tell you they're too busy or they'll be rude to you, but it's going to be the rare exception that happens. So, you know, if I had to do it all over again, I would have had more confidence about, you know, showing my weak spots and, or not, to what you said, acknowledging them. And so, yeah. So is there, I maybe as a board member, you're kind of too far removed from the day to day, but maybe not. What do you think do you think there are new challenges that women and people of color today face that, you know, I mean, you had your set of challenges and many of them have gone away, but then there's what might be different today, or a new set of challenges that some of the folks face that might be a little different than what you had when you were.
I think, you know, probably the biggest one is that people thinks it's fixed, and it's not. You know, that we've got to work at this thing, which is about accepting and understanding difference. And so whether it's gender difference, or if it's racial difference, or if it's ethnic differences, we've got to work at this, because we all come with our own biases. And so therefore, I think, you know, companies have to acknowledge the fact that people are different, and they bring with them these differences and assumptions about people who are not like them. And we've got to be in tune with understanding that we've got to have a culture that, one, is acceptance of difference, because if it's like this discussion of women on boards, do they add value? Well, if you can't answer that question, then you don't need to put a woman on your board. Because, you know, if she's not bringing a different experience, if she's not bringing a different way of thinking, if she's not bringing, you know, an idea that is additive, then you don't. It's the same thing in terms of management. If it's not about checking the box. If you think that, you know, we were talking about Scott Paper Company, very evident, if you're a consumer-driven company, and the primary consumer of yours are female, then don't you think that it would add value to you to have females in the positions that will allow you for them to be more sensitive to ads, or to the way to talk, or to the types of products that are offered? So I think that that's why I say, I think the biggest challenge that still exists is that we make the assumption, because we've got more women in the workforce, because we have more people of color, that it's fixed, and it's not fixed. It's stuff that we've got to be cognizant of and understand, and look at the fact that because we've got this diversity in our midst, that diversity is adding value and allowing us to be better than we would be if we were homogeneous. And if you can't answer that question, then you don't need it.
So let me throw something out there and see if you think this makes sense. But after we spoke a couple of weeks ago, I actually was thinking about my time at PepsiCo and my time in corporate, and how the diversity and inclusion situation, it's changed remarkably. But it seems to me, probably around the time you were coming out of school, people would have said, why do I even want to hire her?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they didn't even see the point, right? And because it was a bunch of guys and they figured they knew what they were doing, and why? By the time I graduated, which was 10 years later, I think, you know, Pepsi was exactly having the thought process of, you know, geez, we sell to families and moms, and, you know, we sell in inner city communities, we sell to African Americans and Latinos. And so so all of a sudden they realized, yeah, there's really a good reason to have people. But the problem back in 1982 was they tried to they weren't doing this consciously. What they didn't realize was you can't take people who are different and force them to be just like you. What you have to do is everybody needs to meet in the middle. Okay. The company culture's got to go this way. And yeah, maybe you have to move a little, but there's a middle ground. And so I think the struggle today still is finding that middle ground or not even that middle ground, where the company can morph more towards the people of diversity and really embrace them and have it be the inclusion thing. So this has gone from, in my mind, from why would I even want to hire that person to, oh, we need them because it's good for our business, or maybe we just don't have enough talent. We got to tap this talent pool, to, okay, but how do we actually morph this whole thing together so that the culture of the company embraces people and we can fully, tap into and utilize their skills. So I don't know, that's sort of the way I was thinking about it. I don't know if you agree, the way this journey is happening.
I do agree. And that's what I mean by we assume it's been fixed.
Yeah.
If we can't get to a company that values that difference, that's the key, that's inclusion.
Yeah.
Then I believe that having you there is going to make us better, going to add value, then it's worth it. You know, then I know that I'm moving in the place of that you can't just take, a woman or a person of color and have the old boys network, the culture that's built on that, and don't assume that you're going to have to modify it to some degree, that you're going to have an understanding that this culture is driven from that, and that now you're introducing this animal that's strange and different, and bringing different ideas, and will react differently to this culture than the way the you guys used to react to this culture. That's what I mean by the fact that we think it's done, so we don't continue to work it. We've got to work this idea of inclusion, that difference adds value, and we're better if in fact we have the experiences, the different points of view, the different headsets that will make us better as a totality, that it's not just counting the numbers.
Absolutely. So why don't we go into the not-for-profit world and talk about that? Do you want to tell us about Girls Incorporated? Tell us about that organization, your role there, tell us about that, because it's fascinating.
Sure. Well, when I decided to leave corporate, my last job, which was the one with the Investor Group, that's the hair care company in Savannah, and I decided to move to the nonprofit world, I didn't know Girls Inc. And it was because they had changed their name in 1990. It used to be the Old Girls Clubs of America. And so it's actually over 150-year-old organization that has really been providing invaluable support for girls in this country and in Canada in terms of dealing with the challenges of growing up female. And that could be anything from economic literacy, leadership, media literacy, preventing adolescent pregnancy, et cetera, getting girls into STEM. And this is done through research-based programming at affiliates around the United States and in Canada. I think it's about 130 cities around. And it's an after-school program. So it's all about empowering girls and giving them the knowledge and the skill to make informed choices in their lives. And that's really the aim of the organization, is to do that, to open the lens so that girls understand opportunities, understand the challenges, understand the messages, and that they're getting this through a caring adult, that through these after-school research-based programs that are offered.
And how many years did you
About
run that?
150 years. It was Girls Clubs of America until 1990, when boys clubs approached girls clubs about merging. And they were actually in discussions. And then it became a court case because girls clubs realized that the boys clubs they just wanted their name. They didn't really want to merge, that the value that they had was not being accepted in a sense. So there was a court case that an attorney, the judge said that these two big youth-serving nonprofit organizations would not be the public wouldn't look kindly on this fight happening in the courts. So they settled, and girls clubs decided to sell the name girls clubs to boys clubs. There was no such thing as boys and girls clubs before 1990. And they took the money and researched a forward-looking name of Girls Incorporated and felt that it was more indicative of what they did and how they did the work that they did. So, it's about, I would say it used to be, and I'm pretty sure it's probably about 60% girls of color. It's family incomes of about $30,000 or less. Usually in cities, the local organizations grow up in communities where they've identified the need, and the national organization that I headed works with the local organizations to train the program deliverers, to train the leaders in terms of how to manage an organization, etc. So the research and programming happens at the national organization. The delivery of the program happens in the local organizations.
What was it like culturally going from the private sector to was it a difficult transition for you, or what was that transition like?
Well, yes, it was different. It wasn't difficult. I would say it was different. I'll explain it this way. When I was in corporate, I always felt like, especially in marketing, I felt like if I produced a great product, the money would come. Mm-hmm. As long as I did a good job, the money would come. Mm-hmm. Here I found myself in a nonprofit environment that we had all of this great stuff we were doing for girls all across this country, with the evidence to prove that in fact that we were having a positive impact. And yet the money didn't necessarily come, because I may have had a long-term funder who has decided, let's say this corporation used to be focused on youth development, has now decided that they're going to deal with gender issues or age issues or whatever it might be, sexual abuse. And I lose that funding that has nothing to do with my performance. Mm-hmm. So I had to understand that I had to constantly tell the story of this organization, but I had to constantly work to try and ensure that the funding sources were, I controlled so much less of my destiny, I would say. Yeah. But on the other side of it, it was probably the most rewarding 10 years of my career, because I could always look to those local organizations or those girls that we would have at our national events and see the impact of this organization every day on the lives of so many young women.
Yeah, it must have been really rewarding to do that. It must have been great. What do you think's happening now with the economic challenges in the nonprofit world in terms of fundraising? Do you have a sense of that, or?
Well, I would only say it's got to be really tough. I was heading Girls Inc. When 9/11 happened.
Uh-huh.
And I'm sure this pandemic is having even a greater impact on the fundraising of the organization. And so it's got to be very, very tough. But, you know, we were talking earlier about saying, well, what do you do? And I think you have long-term funders, and they understand intuitively that this is probably a challenging time for you. So you've got to stay close to the people who've been your supporters. You've got to stay close to your boards, because many times we had an incredible board at the national organization, a lot of corporate people. And I had moved out of corporate, even though I was on a number of boards, but there were a lot of things that I would hear from them about things happening on the corporate side that had implications, or could be things that were accessible to us that we may not have known sitting in that chair. So your board is critical. Your board can help you think about some of those tough decisions that corporations are having to make right now, and how to do that effectively. So I think you've got to stay close to your supporters and donors. You've got to stay close to your board. You've got to be able to have people know what is going on. You know, they don't want to just hear the bad. They want to hear some of the good stories too. And having those, sharing the impact that you're still creating, so that in fact, you know, maybe they've got to reduce a little bit their funding, but hopefully they will continue to support you. But I think you've got to be a voice there, helping them know that, you know, we're still here, we're still doing the hard work, and we really need your support in the context of that, because that's the name of the game.
Do you have advice to, I mean, there are students in the MBA program who want to go into the not-for-profit world. Do you have any advice for people who want to do that?
Well, when I made the change, Al, actually there were not a lot of corporate people moving from corporate to nonprofit. You see it a lot more now. I would say really go there for the right reason. That, you know, you have to understand it is very different from a corporation, from the standpoint of the resources that you have, that you're going to be, it's going to often be all hands on deck, that you won't have the kinds of support that you would have in a corporation. You're not going to make the same kind of money. So if you're going there, really know that I'm going there because I have the reason, I have a passion for doing this thing, but the trappings are not going to be there. And if in fact you think you want to do it, but you say, okay, like I did when I left Columbia, I got to eat. So maybe I've got to take a job. I may have to go into the corporate side for a while, but if I think I want to do this long term, then that'll be my next move. There was a young woman who was a couple of years in a financial institution, and she was disheartened by her experience there. So she felt like, okay, I think I'm just going to go into nonprofit. Well, that's not the right reason. And what I did, it was a friend's daughter. I said, come and spend a week in my office. And I let her meet and talk to people and understand their jobs and understand the challenges. And I said, you know, it's incredibly rewarding. And yes, you're going to get that, but you're going to have to, it's a different world. So you have to understand it is a different world, but it's an incredibly rewarding world. And it's one that we need the smarts of people like a Columbia graduate to fill.
Thank you. So I just got a text telling me, I thought we were going till 2, so I guess this is me being negligent. We were supposed to be done at 1:30, so we run over by 15 minutes. So that's my fault, and I apologize if I took too much of your time.
No problem. No problem. I was enjoying it.
Any last thoughts or?
Well, no, I just think that as the students are leaving Columbia, you've had a great opportunity. You have a great opportunity in front of you. The nonlinear career path, I think, is more accepted even than when I left Columbia. But there's a lot of great things in front of all of you. So I would just say, go for it.
Okay. Thank you so much. Again, I apologize for taking an extra 15
No problem.
minutes here, but this has been fantastic. You're an inspiration for all of us. So thank you very much.
No, it was my pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you.
Thank you.